If NATO collapsed tomorrow, would anyone admit it? Or would we keep pretending the world's strongest alliance is still ready, while its industrial core erodes and its enemies expand? According to former CIA analyst Larry Johnson, the West is dangerously close to finding out. He warns that in raw military terms, Russia now fields a force 3 times larger than NATO's deployable ground capacity. That gap doesn't just come from numbers, it comes from structure. NATO was built for projection, not for protracted high-consumption war. Its logistics depend on precision, not redundancy. Its defense industry assumes small-scale engagements, not a multi-year slugfest against a nuclear power. And that's the problem. In Ukraine, the West has already depleted its reserves of critical munitions, artillery shells, air defense missiles, armored vehicles, at a rate it cannot replenish. Meanwhile, Russia has shifted its entire economy onto a war footing. Ammunition production has doubled. Tank factories are running 24/7. And instead of buckling under sanctions, Moscow has found alternative markets, mostly through Asia and the Middle East. NATO's strategic doctrine assumed that air superiority and precision strikes would decide the next conflict. But in the mud of eastern Ukraine, it's come down to old-school attrition. And the side with more shells, not more hashtags, is winning. That's not a theory. That's the battlefield. Ukraine today is a NATO country in all but name. It receives Western intelligence, weapons, training, and direct logistical support. But despite over $200 billion in aid and the largest coalition backing since World War II, its 2023 counteroffensive failed to achieve strategic goals. Front lines have barely moved. Russian fortifications held. And now Ukraine's air defenses are overstretched, trying to cover too many assets with too few interceptors. Reports from the battlefield suggest that Russia has adapted to drone warfare faster than expected, using electronic jamming, radar spoofing, and layered missile traps to neutralize Ukraine's once advantageous tech. Meanwhile, the political narrative in the West keeps framing Ukraine as one successful offensive away from turning the tide. But maps and satellite footage say otherwise. Russia has re-established control over key logistics corridors, secured energy infrastructure, and continues to rotate fresh units through its southern military district. What's even more telling? Inside Russia, there is no sense of emergency, no total mobilization, no collapse of daily life. Cities operate as usual. Inflation is under control. Recruitment is targeted, not desperate. That level of calm, in the middle of a war this size, suggests a regime that believes it is not only surviving, but winning. If that reading is correct, then Western assumptions about Russian weakness may be dangerously out of sync with reality. And misreading your adversary has consequences far greater than just bad press. It leads to wars you thought you couldn't lose, until you already did. While Western governments measure strength through battlefield positions, another war is being fought in boardrooms, banking systems, and currency reserves. And in that war, the ground is shifting fast. The BRICS alliance, originally a bloc of 5 emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is no longer a symbolic forum. It is evolving into a strategic economic counterweight to the Western-led order. Since the sanctions on Russia intensified in 2022, BRICS members have accelerated their push to reduce dependence on the US dollar. They're building alternative financial rails like BRICS Pay, launching talks on a shared reserve currency sometimes referred to as the R5, named after their 5 national currencies, and transacting more and more in gold, yuan, and rubles. In just the past year, the group expanded its reach by inviting countries like Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia to participate in future frameworks. That's not just symbolic, it's infrastructural. When oil is priced in currencies other than the dollar, when global South trade routes bypass SWIFT, the effect isn't immediate, but it's foundational. It weakens dollar demand, raises borrowing costs in the West, and slowly erodes the financial dominance that has underwritten NATO's power projection for decades. Even former President Trump, while opposing the BRICS agenda, recently floated the idea of a universal 10% tariff on all imports, a move clearly aimed at punishing those who challenge the dollar's primacy. But desperation doesn't equal control, and as this bloc grows more cohesive economically, it may soon act more decisively in political and military terms too. This isn't about abstract finance, it's about who sets the rules of the next global order. And right now, those rules are no longer being written in Washington alone. While the world watches Ukraine and Taiwan, new pressure points are forming in regions most aren't tracking, regions that, if triggered, could pull major powers into broader confrontation. One of them is the Caucasus. Tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia, two countries locked in a generations-long conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, have flared repeatedly in recent months. Azerbaijan, backed tacitly by Turkey and supported technologically by Israel, is now asserting more control than ever. Armenia, historically linked to Russia, has begun to drift westward diplomatically, frustrating Moscow. If a renewed clash erupts there, it won't be isolated. It could serve as a pressure valve or even a proxy spark between NATO-aligned actors and the Russian sphere. Meanwhile, Iran has been quietly repositioning itself. Traditionally dependent on Russian defense systems, Tehran is now sourcing more tech and air defense assets from China, a shift that signals long-term strategic realignment. The Iran-Russia-China triangle, once loosely connected by anti-Western rhetoric, is evolving into a coordinated axis of cooperation, financial, logistical, and military. Joint naval drills have taken place in the Indian Ocean. Intelligence sharing frameworks are rumored to be expanding, and as China eyes control over global shipping lanes and resource routes, Iran's geography becomes a vital piece of the puzzle. The point is simple. Regional conflicts are no longer regional. They are nodes in a global alignment. What happens in the Caucasus, in the Persian Gulf, or in Central Asia doesn't stay contained. Each spark tests the cohesion and readiness of NATO, of the US, and of Europe's fractured diplomacy. And in a multipolar world, the number of sparks increases, even if the media isn't watching. Not every war is fought with missiles. Some are waged through stories, values, and the shape of civilization itself. The conflict unfolding today isn't only military, it's ideological. On one side, you have Western nations promoting a rules-based international order, rooted in global integration, liberal democracy, open markets, and increasingly universal values around identity, governance, and human rights. On the other side, rising powers like Russia and China are rejecting that framework, not just tactically, but philosophically. Russia positions itself as a defender of traditional identity, Orthodox Christianity, national sovereignty, and cultural continuity. China frames its model as disciplined, centralized, and resistant to Western decadence, and what it sees as moral relativism. The battlefield here isn't Donbass or Taiwan. It's the global narrative, and both sides are trying to dominate it. Russia funds media outlets and social campaigns in multiple languages across Europe, Africa, and Latin America. China controls platforms, apps, and telecom infrastructure in dozens of countries, shaping not just the data, but the perception of truth itself. The West, meanwhile, uses soft power through entertainment, education, and diplomacy, but increasingly relies on censorship, content moderation, and algorithmic control to preserve social cohesion. That's not freedom, it's fragility disguised as fairness. The deeper issue is that each side believes its worldview must prevail for global stability to exist. And when cultural legitimacy becomes non-negotiable, the line between disagreement and war becomes thinner. The weapons here are less visible, but their impact is just as real. Because whoever defines what normal looks like wins the next generation before the battle even begins. Looking at all this through a clear lens, the trend lines don't point toward sudden peace. They point toward a new structure of conflict. Not the kind with declarations and treaties, but with overlapping crises that test the ability of nations to respond coherently. The West is overstretched. NATO, for all its history and coordination, is showing signs of strategic exhaustion. Ammunition stockpiles are thin. Industrial ramp-up takes years, not months. Political unity is fragile. The United States, still the backbone of the alliance, is entering another divisive election cycle with global attention on whether its commitments will hold. Meanwhile, Russia and China are not rushing. They're playing a long game, grinding down patience, probing economic weaknesses, watching for fractures. And those fractures are growing. In just 5 years, we could face synchronized pressure points. Taiwan, the Baltics, the Caucasus, the Persian Gulf, not in a perfect storm, but in a designed cascade. If the U.S. gets tied down in a Pacific conflict, even briefly, that might be all it takes to greenlight a second front in Europe. The goal wouldn't be total conquest, it would be overload, strategic paralysis, forcing the West to admit, even if only silently, that it can no longer maintain global primacy. And this is why your attention matters. Because when governments move slowly and media lags behind, the signals fall to individuals to connect, to think 2 steps ahead, to recognize that the battlefield isn't just physical, it's also informational, cultural, economic, and that survival in the 21st century doesn't go to the biggest army, but to the sharpest mind, the one that doesn't wait for permission to prepare. If you're still watching at this point, you're not here for noise. You're here because you understand that headlines don't always show the full picture, and you're ready to see what's underneath. Safety Zone doesn't deal in hype. We follow the signals, connect the dots, and bring you analysis rooted in strategy, not speculation. If that's the kind of awareness you want to sharpen, subscribe now. Because in the next 6 to 18 months, knowing what's coming before it hits won't just be useful, it'll be essential.